the process of creating a book from the ground up. In addition to fostering a love of reading, we provide a plethora of information and sharpen our readers' ability in communication and public speaking skills. If there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. What Toni Morrison says here is absolutely amazing. If not for this thought, if authors didn't dare, there wouldn't be books that we read in which we find so much comfort, inspiration, motivation, or the list is too long. My favorite comfort foods are books by the authors I read, adore, and respect most. One can clear the thoughts, become motivated, and rise over writer's block thanks to their unique combination of intelligent phrases. It is clear that PAB is doing its part to serve their members with a variety of doses of reading that inspires one to write as well. The author's saga, as the name suggests, is about writers. Here we engage in insightful conversations with authors who have made their pens bleed so they can leave a lasting mark in the world. Tonight, we meet Jay Allen, a former British Army Rapid Deployment soldier who is now a serial entrepreneur. Since leaving through medical discharge, Jay has gone on to either buy, acquire, or set up 4 of his own businesses, successfully exiting twice. Qualified in blue ocean strategic thinking, and as a TEDx speaker, Jay shares with audiences around the world the power of big thinking and global impact rather than vanity metrics. He has won Global Impact to Business Award twice, recognized as UK's Clear Business Thinking Power 100. He has an MSc in International Business Studies, a double degree holder. He has a BSc in Ethics and also in Psychology. I warmly welcome Jay Allen to Author's Saga. Hello, Alan. How is it going?
Osmida, thank you so much for having me with you. Thank you.
So, shall we begin?
Sure, I'm delighted. Thank you.
So, tell me, what makes a good writer?
A good writer. For me, it's probably somebody that, one, has a story to tell, but perhaps beyond that, he's also a reader. I think in order to be able to effectively write a book that is compelling enough to pick off the shelf, you have to know what else is on the shelf and understand as to where your story fits within the plethora of other offerings that are available. And to become a good writer, I think you have to become a good reader in order to be able to understand as to the context of how things are being put together, to understand as to how best to be able to put your message forward.
That's amazing. I mean, if you are not a reader, I think you can never be a writer, because these two complement each other and they're like the puzzle that fit together perfectly. Right, yes.
Amen. I often say many people these days consider themselves a speaker purely because we can speak.
Yes.
And yet there is a significant difference between someone that can convey a compelling message and somebody that just ruffles words off their tongue. And it's exactly the same as a writer. I think you need to be involved in writing and reading and understanding literacy in order to be able to better communicate that message off the page.
Absolutely. You need to receive it properly to produce it. Yes.
Amen.
Yes. Are there any authors in particular who have inspired you?
Well, in your very introduction, you spoke so eloquently about our dear friend, Tony Robbins. I'm exceptionally excited to be able to share with you and the PAB audience that I chose in 2020 to invest quite heavily and become a student of Tony Robbins. And I've now worked my way through most of his printed written literature and inspired by the man himself. But beyond that, certainly Michael Gerber from the E-Myth, Robert Kiyosaki from Rich Dad Poor Dad, Napoleon Hill from the old days of Think and Grow Rich are probably 3 of my most most reread and reread books to take inspiration from within my own entrepreneurial journey.
That's amazing. I mean, that is how you become a writer as well. You need to specifically read books that interest you to like ignite the thoughts that might be sleeping within you.
Very much so.
Yeah.
For me, it's always about being able to almost continue the conversation and establish as to, you know, Robert Kiyosaki is a relatively modern writer. He's done, you know, stuff in the very late 70s and 80s and still writes to today. But then when you go back to Napoleon Hill and before him in the 1920s and 1930s, there's so much learning that we can take from the writings of those eras. But in actual fact, then put a more modern slant on it and determine as to how does that reflect in a digital world or in a digital environment, and be able to continue the conversation from writings that have come from previously.
True. So on that line, do you prefer a particular genre, or are you a reader who would read anything that you can get your hands on? And does that really matter?
I don't think it does. I think certainly as a writer, we ought to have a breadth as well as a depth of knowledge with regards to writing and writing styles. But to the same extent, I think it does matter in as much as there is so much literature out there that sometimes we can become overly consumed with breadth as opposed to going into depth. So once you almost found your niche, it's almost a case of importance to be able to stick at that niche and to be able to go further and further into the depth of it, as opposed to continues to flip from one to another. I've certainly determined that autobiographies and stories of success or failure about entrepreneurship are where most of my reading comes from, and then steers me to determine as to what else I want to be able to add to that conversation.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. For instance, like when we talk about stream of consciousness, people say read Virginia Woolf, you know, because she's a master in that, because that is how you can understand the genre, and you know, yeah, but makes perfect sense. So what inspired you to write this particular book? Any goals that you set here to achieve through writing?
So this book has probably been within me for about a decade before I wrote it.
Okay.
And I was so busy acting upon it that I probably didn't allow myself the time to consider writing it in the first place. I always believed that this is the book that was likely to be my memoirs, as opposed to be out and about as it is now. So it was very much a case of I wanted to ensure that the book that we brought to market was as relevant as possible, and I didn't want it to be something that, well, this is what I did 35, 40 years ago, but I'm not really quite sure as to whether it's still relevant right now. I needed to have a book that was as up to date and as up to relevance as possible, but that's something that I could dip in and dip out of and say, and this is what we're doing right now, and this is the impact it's having. So it was very much a case of ensuring that for every word or sentence or page or chapter written, it was very much going back to the drawing board and saying, well, are we actually implementing the things that we're talking about as we're talking about them to ensure that they're as relevant as possible, and sharing the good and the bad and the ugly. So it took about 4.5 years to write my book, to be able to get it to print. And then it was almost Tony Robbins really that inspired me to be able to spend some time properly sitting down and documenting it and ensure it was laid out properly, and commissioning the right people to be able to get a proofreader and a copy setter, and ensuring that it's as good and as professional as it possibly can be, on the premise that if we now know that we have a message that's worth spreading, then we need to ensure that it gets the global coverage that it deserves. And for that, you've then got to go through a process to understand as to how to get that information in front of a global audience.
Very true. So a lot of research, a lot of hard work, loads of discussions would have gone through uh, during the process.
Well,
While
ironically, I mean, we got almost almost to the final hurdles, as it were, of being able to take this to a professional publisher and start to be able to submit to publishing houses and find out as to who we could work with to be able to get this to print, rather than self-publish. And then you're barraged with a whole series of other ideas from publishers with regards to what they want and what's relevant to their audience and the format that they want to go through. And it could have been so easily that we were led by a publisher to perhaps take this book in a completely different slant
path,
to that we
yeah,
so subsequently did. And rather than being swayed by the first interest of a publisher that says, well, we like your content or we like your theories, but we want to go off and do it in this direction and we want it in this format because this is what our audience wants. It's about being able to then be true to yourself and say, but is that really what the essence of the book's about, or am I just tailoring it to somebody else's preferences? And am I willing to be able to say no and walk away and find the right person that is able to embrace who you are and what you've tried to achieve, as opposed to simply taking the first bite of the fish hook of somebody that shows a particular interest?
definitely. And I think it matters a lot because this is your brainchild, and you need to give the right treatment, and the decision has to be taken on how it has to be birthed, right? Yes.
Very much so, and you've got to find the right midwife to be able to birth the right child.
Yes, definitely. Without harming the baby.
Without harming the baby. I didn't want someone to end up with stirrups, pulling it out and damaging it in a way that I could never have repaired.
Definitely,
so it was very much a case of, and I think we ended up working with probably about 13 or 14 different publishers that we went through before we found somebody that was far more sympathetic to being able to sit and listen and learn and understand and consider and then work with us to be able to bring it to print, as opposed to somebody that said that they had a very stringent format that we had to follow that was perhaps outside of what we were hoping to achieve.
True. Kudos to your patience, perseverance, and it has paid off well, you know.
Yes, I'm very much delighted with the results, and with the people that we're working with to bring it to fore. It's been a marriage made in heaven eventually, but you have to kiss a few frogs before you meet a princess.
Definitely. So what's up with the title? Is there any specific reason behind calling it #AddAZero? I hope I'm pronouncing it properly.
You are indeed, yes. So
Yes.
it had a working title, and for anyone that's perhaps considering writing the first book, I would strongly recommend do not get hung up on the title at the point where you're writing the book. For me, the title has to come from the back of having created and almost being ready to birth the book, is to then, you don't think about giving a baby its name before it's been conceived. The conception happens and you go through the first trimester and the second trimester and days or weeks, sometimes even after the birth, do you finally choose a name to christen it. And perhaps the same of a book, really. So we had a long, elongated title for a working title, just something to be able to reference what the project was and what it was about, and as a reminder. And then, ironically, it was working with publishers to be able to say, well, what do we want to achieve and how is that going to be achieved? And I was lucky enough to work with a New York publisher early on in this process. And he said to me, a title and a subtitle needs to cover two things. First of all, if you're going to have a title that tells you exactly what it does, a title that is very distinctive and tells you what's within the book, then you need to have a subtitle that's almost intriguing or insightful or in some way creates interest in reading. He says, and alternatively, you do it the other way around. He says, and you create something that's rather intriguing as a title, and then you have a subtitle that confirms people's knowledge and understanding. So when we went through this exercise to establish as to, well, which way round are we going to go it, and what are we going to try and create, and where's the intrigue going to come from? I went to a steering group of people that I'd sent the copy text through to be able to get some testimonials and some case studies and the person who wrote the foreword for me. I went to my steering group, my reading steering group, and I said, look, obviously the title that we had, the working title, was almost a book in itself. It was an elongated title. We need to be able to shorten this down to something that's catchy and runs off the tongue. Can we have some suggestions, and then we'll perhaps throw them into the mix and find out as to where we get to. And subsequently, somebody said, well, have you noticed that the case studies of the people who you worked on to prove that the concept works have all mentioned that applying the methodology has helped them to add a zero?
Okay.
And I said, well, that's interesting. It's enabled them to be able to not just grow, but scaled to 10x their business, or at least their personal disposable income as a result of applying the methodology. But where did you read that from? And he says, well, they've started to use the hashtag add a zero. And I went, that's it. We're going to use the hashtag add a zero. And ironically, the first time I typed it into Google, I found that there were 364 other people who'd read the book and the methodology and already started to apply it and started to use this hashtag before we'd even created it and given it a name. So the two were married and came together, and it's subsequently gone on from there.
Yeah. Interestingly, it sounds a little bit Greek as well, There's some sophistication to the title. Me being a bit curious, what was the working title?
So the working title was The 3 Flaws and the 11 Steps to Overcome Overwhelm in order to be able to grow your business.
Okay. That's a book in itself, right, isn't it?
You needed a far bigger page just to be able to fit it on.
Definitely. But add a zero, I think, it perfectly summarizes the entire thing that's going on in the
tongue. It flows off.
Yeah, definitely. Right. So tell us a little bit about the book now.
Sure, thank you. My second business, I finished the army, I'd worked in corporate, I'd done some change management work, I'd chosen to leave corporate and to set up on my own. I take my hat off with pride to anybody that chooses on the day to be able to leave and set up their own business. I cheated the first time round. I hold my hands up completely. I cheated the first time round. I'd received a good income from my corporate career. I left with a golden handshake for a job well done at the end of my corporate career, and chose to invest in buying an existing business. So I bought a local business that was for sale. It had been trading for 14 years. It had got a number of members of a few members of staff. It had got a reputation and a brand, and it was okay. And the only reason it was for sale is, unfortunately, the founder of the business, the owner of the business, had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and didn't want to have to lay off members of staff whilst he went through hospitalization and radiotherapy and chemotherapy. He was looking for someone to be able to take the business on, so there was one less worry whilst he concentrated on his own health. And we exchanged emails and conversations and meetings, and subsequently came together, and I agreed to buy the business off him on the premise that I employed all of the staff he had, that there would be no redundancies as a result of the change of ownership. And I took on the business. I had very little knowledge of the industry whatsoever. And I simply said to the existing team, look, I've got no intent of owning a small business. I've come from corporate, and I'd like to go back to corporate, and I'd like to take this business and turn it into a corporate. Who's with me? And the majority of the staff said, brilliant. We are so thrilled to hear that we've got somebody that's enthusiastic about growing the business. We're rather bored right now. We're in it. Let's go. And there was a couple of members of staff. I'll never forget one of them, a gentleman called Gordon, bless him, came to me afterwards and he said, "Does that mean I've got to stop playing golf on Wednesdays?" And I said, "Well, unless your golf is generating 4 times your income in new inquiries, then yes." So he subsequently left to go and play golf, and the rest of the team were hungry to be able to grow the business. And we aggressively applied all of my learnings from being in the military and all of my learnings and subsequent qualifications from change management in corporate. And we aggressively grew the business. We went from 4 staff to 17 staff in less than 2 years. We were on a good growth spurt. And then in 2008, we'd signed a contract with a huge corporate in the UK called Woolworths, about 60 days before Woolworths went into administration. And I'd already sunk tens of thousands of pounds into being able to take on new staff and winning a new contract and supplying a new customer. And we lost £250,000 in a phone call when we were told that the company had gone into administration and there was no money left to be able to pay any of the suppliers. And it was a huge impact to us in our business. I ended up having to remortgage my house. I borrowed all of the money I possibly could from the bank to be able to try and keep the business going. I ended up having to let some members of staff go in order that the whole business didn't collapse. It was an incredible, painful time in my life, and something that, 12, 13 years later, I still don't wear those scars very well. And I vowed that, okay, we did a turnaround and we applied all of the teachings that I'd learned, but perhaps didn't necessarily want to have to implement in my own business. We did a turnaround. We got the business back on its feet again. 3 years later, I chose to sell that business with 22 members of staff and going particularly well. But I'd fallen out of love with it because of the impact it had had on me. And I vowed when I sold the business that I was going to do 2 things. First of all, that I would never recruit anybody else into a new business until I could promise them a career and not just a job. I needed to know that if I was going to take other people on, that there was promise for them moving forward, and that I would never have to face the thought of having to make redundancies ever again. So first of all, we looked at how do we de-risk business? What do we need to do in order to be able to ensure that when we take people on, we can create careers for them? And then subsequently, latterly from that, I wanted to understand as to how such a big business like Woolworths, at the time that we signed a contract with them, they employed 37,000 people. They did 4 billion turnover a year, the year before they went bust. I wanted to understand as to how do you get to 93 years old and then make such an error that everything collapses. So I bought the data from the receivers that they'd used to close Woolworths for me to look at and establish where did they go wrong. It was exactly at the same time that I started to notice on the internet, many people were starting to be able to offer a business success blueprint. There were people out there that were doing well, that were growing their own business, and then subsequently chose to be able to document their process, and were now selling an opportunity for other people to learn from them what they've done. And interestingly, I chose to buy one. I'm not going to name the person who sold it to me. That would be unfair and unethical. But I chose to buy somebody's business success blueprint and thinking, if only I had one of these a few years earlier, it might have fixed the... And the simple fact is, it wouldn't. Because what I quickly learned, just in this business, just as there was in the Woolworths business, the missing ingredient was, how do I translate that from what they've done, their business, to achieve their success, to how do I get it to be the same success in my business?
Nice.
And the simple fact is, I've now bought probably about 7 or 8 different business success blueprints from some very successful people in their own right, just to identify that there's still this missing ingredient, the bit that says, and this is what you need to do in order to be able to make it effective for you. But the simple fact is, no one knows what that is because they're busy doing it for themselves.
Yes.
And the only time it ever really works is if you follow it to the letter and you give up every aspiration that you've got of being able to achieve success in your own right, and you simply copy somebody else's business in their industry, in their sector, in their field, with the hope that they've got the same experience and qualification and backgrounds to be as successful as the person you're following. And for me, that just didn't make sense. So instead of being able to set up a business success blueprint, we chose to research what causes businesses to fail. How do you overcome or mitigate failure? I firmly believe that there is so much more that we can learn from failure than we'll ever learn from success. And yet the moment we use the word failure, no one wants to know, and you quickly past it. So we spent 7 years looking at what caused some of the biggest businesses in the world to collapse and fail, to identify what were the problems and what can we learn from them and mitigate the risk so we don't have the same fate. And it's called Add a Zero because what we've learned is by teaching people how not to fail, the flip side of failure is success. And if we can prevent you from failing, it gives you so much more confidence to do the things that you should be doing anyway, instead of following somebody else's success, but creating your own.
Yes, that's amazing. That's a totally, I think, a very different way of looking at the problem, because we do talk about failure, but we never examine or see how failure can help us,
Absolutely.
Yes. It's more like happiness and sadness as well. To understand happiness, you need to acknowledge sadness.
Amen. And ironically, you've only got to, if we go back to the analogy, the book and the likes, you've only look at a small child who learns to walk. Now, then they see an adult standing on these two things a lot taller than them, they don't think, hang on a minute, I'm just going to crawl for the rest of my life. They have a go and they fall over. And sometimes they bang their head and they're upset and they cry, but they don't give in. It spurs them on to do it again and again and again and again and again and again until they take the first step and the second step, and before you know it, they're running. And it's exactly the same. We've got to be able to look within ourselves for, okay, so it didn't work the way that I'd hoped it would. So what do I need to do differently next time to get a better outcome, rather than saying, well, that's it, I'm not doing that, I'll try something else.
I think it's what Thomas Alva Edison said about, I did not fail, but I have learned 1,000 different ways of how not to do it,
Absolutely.
Yes.
And ironically, if we take that analogy through to its end conclusion, Edison and the light bulb went on to become the founder of General Electric, the largest electronics company in the world. Because you can take the same methodology of, well, I've now learned 1,000 ways not to do it, and I can now apply 1,000 ways to every other thing that I now subsequently do to know not to do those things next.
Exactly. So that's learning everywhere in everything you do. Brilliant. Amazing. So there are many entrepreneurial related books out there. And how does this particular book differ from them? I mean, we know that you're talking about how to understand failure, and whom do you think you would recommend this book to?
Thank you. It's a great question. Yes, if there was ever a competition, then I don't think there's ever been a more competitive era than the subject of entrepreneurship, and certainly entrepreneurship in print. When we first launched and we went onto Amazon, just to be able to see not just the 1 or 2 books, but the 147 books in entrepreneurship that were launched on the same day that my book came out,
Wow.
in that sector just tells me as to how competitive a field it really is. And yet the majority of books around entrepreneurship, and don't get me wrong, I've probably read 500 or 600 entrepreneurial books in the last decade or so to be able to be inspired by other great writers. The majority of people are talking about either their own success or the success that they've witnessed by interviewing other people. I can't think of many books that I've spent the last 7 years and nearly £200,000 worth of research looking into what causes failure. I can't think of other books in this field, or perhaps many other fields, that have spent so much time and effort and understanding, research and funds looking at failure. And again, it's such a taboo subject. You're almost better off talking about COVID than you are talking about failure. No one wants to admit to it. And yet, if we can remove the taboo of failure and say, well, what lessons can I learn from it? Then in actual fact, it'll enable so many other people to not fall into the same fate. Well, that's the first thing. But the second main difference, I think, from this to many, not all the books, I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination it's completely unique, although I'd like to think it is.
I'm sure it is.
But one of the other things is I haven't written it as a reading book. I've written it as a guide. And the intent is that I don't envisage anyone is going to pick this up from start to finish and read it over a weekend. Quite frankly, I wouldn't recommend that anyone was to choose to do that either. This book has been written with the intent of being able to help a business owner, be they first setting up in business and pre-trade and pre-revenue, all the way through to employing staff and perhaps even thinking of selling the business, as I've done a couple of times now over. It's set as a guidebook to be able to say, if ever you have an inkling of uncertainty or not quite sure what to do or when to do or how to do, then you can simply dip into a page or two and say, well, what does the evidence, not what does Jay say about this, but what does the evidence of over 150 other national businesses or global businesses that grew and failed, does the evidence support the things that I shouldn't do and therefore that are left open to me? So it's not statistically based, it's not full of facts and figures and tables. Everything within the book, every page, every word within the book, based on research and percentages, of now over, well, we've now surveyed almost 120,000 SME businesses from around the world to establish as to how relevant is this in their business right now. And we continue that we probably have about almost 3 dozen businesses a day that complete our survey. And every time the survey is completed, it updates the research that then supports that every word spoken in the book is as relevant and up to date as possible, to say these are the risks that you run at some stage in business if you don't have these things in place, and these are the things to have in place, and this is why you need to have them in place. Sometimes it even says, and this is the stage of business that you ought to get to before you think about putting these things in place. But it's all about being able to give us the stepping stones that teach the baby how to get up and crawl and walk and then run, to subsequently go off and be independent and be themselves.
Definitely, this is not a one model for all kind of book. This is custom made for whoever who's reading. You can pick what you want and use it to apply it to your need and circumstance. Yes.
Massively. We don't want this to be shelf development. We don't want it to be one that just sits there on the shelf somewhere and never gets read. Ironically, I've got one of the steering group. I mean, this is less than 3 years old. It's 2 years old now. But we've got somebody at the moment who has come to me and said, Jay, can I have a second copy? Because the first copy I bought is so well worn. The pages are so well worn now that I need to be able to see if I can possibly take a second copy, just so I can keep reading it. The front cover has become so worn that it's almost not protecting him the book and the pages any longer, because it's a constant reference guide to both him and his business, which is most flattering to think of a business that's doing exceptionally well. It's well into its 6 figures, almost 7-figure turnover right now, and yet still being used as almost a daily guide to be able to say, this is what, and this is how, and this is what's to do, and these are the things that really shouldn't be done. It's been a real pleasure to be able to know that it's being as referenced and as well used as possible. And that's my intent. We've certainly been able to determine that our mission and the goal for this book is to be able to get a copy into 1 million business owners' hands, in order that we can help and grow the whole SME community globally, to be able to help more and more people have more and more confidence to be able to do what's necessary, how it's necessary, when it's necessary, to be able to make the right difference to them and their community and the people with whom they serve. I'm a firm believer, and looking not just across the UK, but globally, that it's SME businesses, it's small micro businesses, it's family-run businesses, it's husband and wife couples, it's businesses from around the world of small groups of people that are making the biggest impact to local communities, to people in which they serve, to people that are around the world that need the help and support of being able to know what to do next. And it's vitally important that we're able to be able to get this information to as many people as possible, to be able to give them the confidence and the competence to be able to do what's necessary, to be able to shore up the business, to give them the confidence to be able to do what's next, and hopefully to be able to take somebody else on and to be able to grow a small micro business into a bigger, more thriving business. Forgive me, there seems to be a bit of an audio problem right now. I'm not quite sure if you can hear me, but there appears to be a bit of an audio problem at the moment. So I'm just going to quickly refer to the message that's in the chat to find out as to what's being said. I'm more than happy to be able to continue the interview as we go. But like I say, we seem to have had a bit of a problem with the audio on the feed. And so I'm just going to refer to the questions that are being posed to me in the chat function, in order that I can ensure that we provide the service to you, the Pick a Book audience. I noticed that I've got something actually that's been typed on Facebook here from Shuvo. It says, Jay, your Add a Zero book is already helping thousands of entrepreneurs to transfer their lives and businesses, including yourself. Sincerest of thanks. That's most kind of you, Shuvo, to be able to acknowledge the fact that this book is already helping you in your business also. The next question it says here is, language has power. When did you come to realize the power that language holds? Well, for that, I'm going to have to refer back to most fortunate to know the name of my English teacher back in primary or secondary school, a lady called Kate Lake. And Kate, if you're watching this, I can't tell you as to the impact that you continue to have on a far older student these days. But the love that you had for literature, that you compelled everybody in the class. We were just almost mesmerized by your love of books and what you were able to be able to translate to an otherwise rather unruly student, but led me to be able to understand the love of books that you have. That's led me on this journey. I'm certainly very conscious of the fact that certainly throughout my formative education, I was a very poor reader. I'm not saying I couldn't read. I'm saying that I didn't get anything from the print. And yet, having met Kate and been a student of Kate through my secondary years at school, and finding inspiration from her love of words and how she was able to communicate those in such a way that it resonated with every student on the course, was key to me being able to pick up the mantle a little bit later on when I went into secondary education and then into college and university and subsequently I've probably read far, far, far more books in the last 2 or 3 years than I ever did through my formative education. And I still say it's through the love and aspiration and motivation of my old English teacher, Kate Lake, in my secondary school education that led me to be able to share that love in adult life. Faz, you've been kind enough to be able to then say, have you ever had writer's block, and how do you deal with it? My God, writer's block. Yes, this book should have been out probably about 4 years before it was. And yet I think that's relevant and necessary. You see, I don't think that you can force good writing. Certainly, you've only got to look at some of the literal greats from not just this era, but from eras gone by, to understand that some of them talk about writer's block for years at a time, and saying that the story's within, and yet they don't yet have the words to know how to be able to communicate that. And I certainly think that there are times where I'm an avid film watcher. I love watching film of all different descriptions, and yet sometimes you look and watch a film, and almost halfway through, you think, hang on a minute, they appear to have lost the plot. They appear to have gone off on some form of tangent. They appear to have almost gone off down a rabbit hole somewhere and are not quite sure where it's gone. And you lose track. Sometimes I watched a film last night and I said to my wife at the end, do you think that they just got 3/4 of the way through and then just run out of money and the budget finished? Because the film had such a weird and odd and almost crescendo type ending to it. There wasn't a big finale. And I think exactly the same can happen with a book. If you force yourself to be able to say, well, this is the deadline and I've got to get it to the publisher by X, then in actual fact, the words on the page often reflect the energy in which they've been written with. And therefore, I know that this book is a long time in the coming. Like I say, we started the research into this in 2013, and yet this book was published in 2021, mid-COVID. It was a long time in the coming, because I needed to ensure that, one, every word within the book is relevant and up to date, but written with the right energy and with the right intent for the right audience to be able to get the right impact. So when it comes to writer's block, yes, I think we can all have a mind blank or a mind fog. And sometimes it's about accepting that, as opposed to trying to push and force a way through it. It's about being able to acknowledge that, do you know what? If the words aren't here today, if the energy isn't within me today, if I'm not going to communicate the right message with the right intent to the right audience, then perhaps rather than forcing it, I need to stop and sit in, why is that so? And acknowledge that, accept that. Like I say, just simply sometimes sit in it and just wait and understand that the words will come at the point where they're ready to be expressed on the page in the right manner to be able to get the right message to the right audience. I hope that makes perfect sense. Certainly, I've got a big grin on the screen, as if to say that certainly resonated with you, Fasmir, also. Which part of the book was the most challenging to write? I think for me, the biggest challenge for writing this book was to acknowledge my own level of knowledge of work and of books and of authors and of business, and to not allow that to distract from the words that needed to be written for the reader. I think sometimes it could have been far too easy, certainly with a very technical book or something with a guide and this and the other, is we can have this inner assumption that other people know what you're talking about, that other people know what you know, and therefore you're writing down at a level of your understanding, of your background, of your experience. And sometimes, certainly I would recommend for every writer, to stop before you can put the words on the page. I'll certainly give a tip here and say that the first copy of the book, the first draft that I wrote, was almost twice as many words as in the final publication. I think we actually edited about 46 or 47% of the original manuscript that went into the printed copy. And there's a need for a writer to be able to get the words out of here and onto a page, but then to have the humility to be able to say, but what does the reader need to read rather than what does the writer need to write? And I think there's a real necessity in that, certainly in the final edit, in the proofreader, in the copy, and the copy edit, to be able to ensure, is every word spoken relevant to the reader, to the level of competency that we expect the reader to be at in order to be able to get benefit from this? And how much of this is either ego of the author or assumption that some of the words spoken aren't necessarily relevant or need further explanation and further confirmation as to what's being said and why that's relevant. So I think it's key to being able to ensure that the proofreader of the book is in no way related to, or perhaps hasn't even seen, the first copy edit, and is able to understand the need of the reader, and then to establish as to what are the words that need to be spoken, in which order, what's the feel of the book, the energy within the book, how do we convey that message compellingly to the reader, as opposed to just to satisfy the needs of the authors to get that information out of their head. Yeah, it says here, it takes an immense strength to cut chunks of during drafting and editing. My God, it does. The first time that I saw the pages and pages and pages of scoring through that were done by the copy editor, it was almost makes you cry, as if to say, well, hang on a minute, this is my work, this is my work. I've spent so much time crafting all of these words and pages that, what do you mean you're going to write off all of this overture? And the simple fact is that every word spoken has to have meaning, and it has to have meanings to the reader and not necessarily just to the author. So being willing to be able to have almost a scat copy, a large blank sheet of paper in which you empty all of your head and thoughts onto, almost a spider diagram where things go all over the place, and then subsequently allow somebody else to be able to craft that into a carefully orchestrated story that takes people on a journey from zeros to hero, as I call it, and accepts the fact that you are not the right persons to do that internally. It's all about being able to have somebody else to understand and sit in the reader's perspective that will actually make the final cut and make it what it is. It's about the reader as much as it is the writer. It's the writer's job to be able to write the story. It's the proofreader's copy and the readers to be able to acknowledge and enjoy that story from there on hereafter. And to acknowledge that if you do a good job, then the reader then conveys that message to the next reader and the next reader and the next reader, as opposed to simply the author saying, do you want to buy my book? Your job is to be able to get that message to the world. It's the reader's job to be able to understand that message so compellingly that they then share that with their audience, and it gathers momentum there on in. Ironically, it was through a third party that introduced me to Shuvo, who introduced me to Pick a Book, that led me to being able to be invited to this interview. It wasn't that I automatically came forward and said, I'd love for you to read my book, or vice versa. It's gone through a series of iterations of other people that have enjoyed the work that has led us to be able to have these conversations today. I'm just quickly checking on the messages to be able to see if anything else has been come through. It says here, we'll be expecting another book in the future. Great question. I'm pleased that you asked. If so, do you want each book to stand on its own, or are you trying to build a body of works which connects between each book? Well, it's funny you should ask that, because this, ironically, is my third published book. I've got two previously. My first one came out in 2015 and is all about military leadership and looking at the transition from a military leader to a civilian leader and looking all about leadership. My second book, that one was called Battlefield to Boardroom. My second book came out 2 years later, and interestingly enough, from feedback I received from my first book. My second book is called The Road to Utopia. And some of the feedback I received from my first book around leadership was, Jay, you speak a lot around leadership and teams. Well, I've liked your writing, but we don't yet have a team. I'm a solopreneur. I haven't yet got other people within my business. So that your book is not yet relevant to me. So my second book, although it came out 2 years later, Road to Utopia, 2017, it's all about how to be able to grow a business quickly in order to be able to build a team. Because I need you to be able to read the first book, Battlefield to Boardroom. But if you haven't got a team yet, then let's talk to you about how to build a business and grow a team. So that one was a body of work in its own right. It complemented the first book. And ironically, when the second book came out, it boosted sales of the first book, because people then subsequently saw the needs to be able to tie the two together. This one was completely different because, like I say, this is a guide book as opposed to a reading book. But I did say that 46% of the copy didn't make it to the print. So what I've subsequently done, and I've been working on, ironically, this morning with my proofreader, is how do we make better use of that other copy that I've written and perhaps didn't make the cut for this book. So this book will be a body of 2. This is volume 1, and volume 2 has now been fully written and is now with the proofreader. I've probably written another 30 or 40% on top of the stuff that didn't make it to the copy of this book. We've gone back and said, well, why didn't it make it? And what do I need to do to make it more relevant? We understood that this one is all about being able to help people formulate good foundations. This one was all about being able to help people to identify the potential risks or vulnerabilities in their existing business and how to overcome those in order that we haven't got the risk of failure before we start to hit the accelerator and scale. This will allow people to be able to go on to add a zero comfortably. But the next book, which will be still be called Add a Zero, but this one's called The Ultimate Guide to Establishing a Good Base Camp. The next one will be called Scale and Exit Successfully. Add a Zero, Scale and Exit Successfully. It'll come out before Christmas this year, and it'll all be about, once you've applied these principles and we've started to see the speed and acceleration of your business, now how do you hold on to the reins quickly enough that if you've got this business that's hurtling along at 1,000,000 miles an hour and growing exponentially, is to how do you stay in control of the mighty beast that you're creating? So the next book is a follow-on to this book, and it's looking at how to replicate, duplicate. It'll look at mergers and acquisitions. It'll look about being able to take your business global, and it's looking about the global audience and how do we then translate our business that it becomes relevant in other cultures and other countries, in other eras, to ensure that we have a legacy to lead and live, not just leave to our grandchildren. So in terms of is this another book in the future? Yes, thank you very much for asking. This is almost a promo for what is about to come. And I'm delighted to be able to share that I'm hoping to be able to take both this and the subsequent book that comes out in the summer on a global tour, of which we'd love to be able to come to Sri Lanka and share the message and do a book launch, perhaps in Sri Lanka in the autumn or winter of this year, looking at both scale foundations and then how to accelerate. The intent, I've certainly had 2 invitations so far through local BNI chapters to be able to come along and to be able to share that message physically, perhaps do some workshops alongside it to be able to support that. So I'm very keen to be able to ensure that this book and its predecessor, as it were, gets as wide an option as possible to be able to ensure that we can ignite the world and to be able to put the right things in place that give business owners just like you the confidence and the competence to do what's necessary to apply the principles of a scalable business that enables you to be able to take on more staff, that has a bigger impact on both you and your family and your community, and shores up the future of SME business globally around the world. It's my sole intent that if we can work with enough business owners by spreading the message about this book, that we can create more and more employment, we can take on more and more staff, that collectively we could eradicate unemployment by creating more new jobs by small business owners than there are people actively seeking employment. And that's the mission of me and this book and this whole business, is to be able to eradicate unemployment by creating more new jobs than there are people seeking work. I can't wait to get my hands on all 3 books and the ones to come. Thank you. That is such a delight to be able to hear. Thank you so much for being able to give me this opportunity to be able to share a few thoughts and ideas, the Pick a Book audience. It's been a real pleasure to be able to share some time with you this afternoon. Thank you. I'm just quickly checking on the copy. It says, brilliant. Thank you so much. This looks absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be able to be of service here this afternoon. I'm just, like I say, we've had a problem with the audio halfway through this interview. So I've been checking out on the chat messages from our host, Fasminas, to be able to ensure that we're able to be able to provide this to you this afternoon. So I'm most delightful and thankful for you and your time this afternoon. Like I say, I'm very fortunate to have spent some time in the military, and certainly in the army. My regiment, we all have a regiment and we all have a core motto. Our core motto within my corps was Inardius Fidelis. It's always Latin for some strange reason, but Inardius Fidelis, which translates in English to faithful throughout adversity. And again, technology is a phenomenal thing. The very fact that we're having this conversation today, and I'm based in the UK, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon here, and we're having this live debate and conference with people from all over the world, particularly from Sri Lanka today. Technology is phenomenal. We've become so reliant upon it, and yet we can have some technical difficulties. And it's just as I say in the book, it's not about the things that are thrown to us. It's not about the failures in life, like the audio thread on this presentation. It's all about being able to be offered the challenge and accepting the challenge and saying, do you know what? What do I need to do in order to achieve the outcome that I set out to achieve? And if I can't do it the way that I wanted to, instead of giving up and saying, do you know what? We'll try again. It's about being able to say, okay, this is the hand that I've been dealt with. How best do we work with that to still achieve the outcome that we set out to achieve in the first place? And I sincerely hope that perhaps I've been living proof today of it's never about the challenges that we face. It's about being able to say, stepping up and saying, okay, that's what we've been thrown today. How best do we deal with it to achieve the outcome that we set to achieve in the first place? And I'm delighted to be able to say that that seems to have been achieved today. I sincerely hope that you've got something from it. Don't forget, Add a Zero, the ultimate guide to establishing a solid base camp in which you can scale both you and your business. God bless, take care, and I very much look forward to being able to be out there in Sri Lanka, hopefully before Christmas, to be able to bring 2 books to you and share some more thoughts about how you can add a zero to your personal disposable income. God bless, take care, and I look forward to seeing you again real soon.